Hi everyone, today I'm looking at one of Canon's latest lenses which has started shipping with new cameras, the EF-S 18 to 135mm f3.5 to 5.6 IS STM. This is the newest version of Canon's 18 to 135mm lens, and as well as having an improved autofocus system, it's also supposed to have much improved picture quality. Well, we'll be the judge of that. It's an EF-S lens, so it won't work on Canon's expensive full-frame digital cameras. The 18 to 135mm focal range makes this a super zoom lens. It can zoom from reasonably wide angle all the way to telephoto. Other super zoom lenses can reach further, up to 200 or even 300mm, but 135mm is still very good, and having a shorter zoom range can often mean fewer compromises on picture quality. The disadvantage of a super zoom lens is that they don't give you a very wide maximum aperture, which means they don't let in much light. This also means it's quite hard to get an out of focus background with this lens, so it's not particularly good if you want to get more creative pictures or nice looking portrait shots. Thankfully though, the lens does have image stabilization. Here's some video footage with it turned off, and now turned on. This helps you to get much sharper pictures and better handheld video work. The image stabilization is quite smooth as you pan the lens around, as you can see in this footage. It also works very quietly, which is another bonus for video work. So let's look at the lens's build quality. As you can see here, it's quite small and compact considering its long zoom range, and although it's made of plastic, the lens feels quite solid and tightly assembled. The zoom ring works nice and smoothly, which is always a bonus. The lens uses Canon's new STM autofocus system. This means a couple of things. Firstly, its focus system works using a special motor electronically coupled to your camera. So you can only change focus when the camera is turned on, and the motor runs slightly behind as you turn the focus ring. It feels slightly odd, but it is responsive enough. And the focus ring is also extremely smooth, which is great news if you're doing video work. The lens's front element doesn't turn or extend as you focus, which is a lifesaver if you're using a polarizing filter. And of course, the autofocus system is amazingly quiet and very fast indeed. As you can see, there's not a hint of noise or movement as you autofocus. So, apart from the relatively slow maximum aperture, this lens would obviously be very useful for handheld video work. When it comes to image quality, Canon's original 18 to 135mm lens was a little bit questionable, so let's see what Canon can pull out of the bag with this new STM version. We'll test it on an 18MP Canon 60D. At 18mm with the aperture wide open at f3.5, we see very good sharpness and contrast in the middle of the image, without any kind of purple fringing. As we look into the corners of the image, we still see acceptable sharpness, although there's quite a lot of pink and green chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. As we stop the lens down to f5.6, we see much more sharpness in the corners, although unfortunately the chromatic aberrations remain. Back in the middle of the image, we see fantastic sharpness and contrast. So, apart from the chromatic aberration, at 18mm it's a performance on the good side of average. Let's zoom in halfway to 50mm. The maximum aperture has now halved to f5. Again, in the middle of the image we see very good sharpness, and the contrast levels are just okay. When we look in the corners of the image, the sharpness is decent enough, and now the chromatic aberrations have greatly reduced. Stop the lens down to f8 and there's a tiny bit of extra sharpness in the corners, and the middle of the image looks fantastic. So a very similar performance in terms of sharpness at 50mm. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 135mm. It's the same story once again. What a steady show. We see good sharpness in the centre of the image and a little softer in the corners, with a little visible chromatic aberration. Once more, if you stop down to f8, there's a decent amount of sharpness in the corners, although the chromatic aberrations remain. Sharpness in the middle of the frame becomes excellent again. Overall, the lens gives a fairly good performance when the aperture is wide open, and stop the lens down a bit for much more sharpness. I would have hoped to see a bit less chromatic aberration, but at least that can be corrected in editing software. For a super zoom lens, overall, the picture quality is better than average. Let's look at distortion levels. They're fairly ugly, I'm afraid. We see rather strong barrel distortion at 18mm, which goes away as you zoom in to about 30mm. At 50mm, we see some light pincushion distortion, which gets more noticeable at 135mm. This is the kind of roller coaster ride of distortion you'd expect to see on a super zoom lens. Some good news is that the quality of the background blur, or bokeh, is pretty nice on this lens. It's nice and soft at 18mm, but you're more likely to see it when you zoom in. But as you can see here, it's still pretty good at 135mm. The lens can focus pretty close to your subject, which is always useful. The picture quality at f5.6 is pretty sharp, and it becomes even better when you stop the lens down to f8, so that's a pretty average performance. Still useful though. The lens's performance against bright lights is fairly good. There's not too much of a loss of contrast, and flaring doesn't seem to be too much of an issue either. Good to see. So overall, the Canon 18-135mm IS STM is simply a nice super zoom lens, a little sharper than the average. It has the normal distortion problems of a super zoom lens, as well as the boring, narrow maximum aperture, so it's not a particularly creative lens. But the fantastic STM autofocus motor, nice build quality, and dynamic image stabilization means it'll handle very well indeed for all kinds of photography and video work. This lens is a close equivalent to Canon's classic 15-85mm EF-S lens. So if you're looking for a good super zoom lens, which one should you buy? The older 15-85mm case is not the strongest. It's bigger and heavier, it's much more expensive, and it doesn't have as wide a zoom range. However, the 15-85mm is sharper, and it goes as wide as 15mm, which is actually a good amount wider than 18mm. I love the wide-angle capability of the 15-85mm lens, but this new 18-135mm STM lens will undoubtedly be much more popular, and not just for its lower price. If you're on the market for a super zoom lens, despite their limitations, then this is simply a great option, as well as being very good value for money.